There is a particular kind of psychological suffering that does not come from loss, rejection, or failure. It comes from arriving at a stage of life that requires a self you never built. For most of their lives, narcissists move forward without needing depth. Momentum replaces reflection. Control replaces intimacy. Winning replaces becoming. As long as life rewards motion, the narcissistic structure holds. But the second half of life quietly changes the rules. It does not announce itself with catastrophe. It simply stops cooperating. What once worked no longer works, not dramatically, but consistently. The admiration thins out. The roles lose authority. The same stories no longer impress. And slowly, without a visible collapse, the narcissist encounters something far more threatening than humiliation: immobility. This is the stage Carl Jung described as the psychological turning point of life, where meaning must replace performance and inner coherence must replace external validation. But narcissism is not designed for this turn. It is a forward-driving system with no reverse gear and no inward passage. When expansion ends, there is nowhere to go. The narcissist cannot retreat into the self, because there is no stable self there, only a persona reinforced by repetition and reward. They also cannot reinvent themselves, because reinvention requires admitting that the old identity was incomplete. So they remain suspended between what no longer feeds them and what they are structurally unable to become. This is not a temporary crisis. It is a permanent psychological bottleneck. The mind begins looping instead of evolving. The past becomes a refuge rather than a memory. Resentment replaces desire. Control hardens where flexibility should emerge. And because nothing visibly breaks, the suffering is often invisible to others, but constant to the narcissist. They are still alive, still functional, still speaking, but internally they are stalled. The second half of life exposes this stall mercilessly. It does not punish, it does not confront, it simply waits. And waiting is unbearable for a personality that only knows how to move outward, dominate the moment, and outrun the parts of itself that were never allowed to exist. The stall exposed in the second half of life does not happen randomly. It happens at a very precise structural fault line. The narcissist is trapped inside a persona that was engineered for a different psychological era. Persona, in Jungian terms, is not inherently pathological. It is the social interface, the mask, that allows an individual to function in the world. But for the narcissist, persona is not an interface. It is the entire operating system. From early adulthood onward, identity is built almost exclusively around performance. Being impressive, being admired, being dominant, being indispensable. This construction works remarkably well in the first half of life, because society actively rewards it. Youth amplifies charm. Ambition converts into status. Confidence is mistaken for substance. The world becomes a stage that constantly feeds the mask, and as long as that feeding continues, the narcissist experiences movement as proof of selfhood. But the second half of life quietly withdraws that fuel. Roles age out. Authority becomes symbolic rather than absolute. Physical presence no longer commands automatic attention. Cultural relevance shifts away from the traits that once defined power. What collapses here is not merely influence, but the narcissist's primary source of psychological regulation. The persona that once stabilized the inner emptiness no longer receives enough external reinforcement to function. Yet abandoning it is impossible. There is nothing underneath that can take over. This is the deadlock. To let go of the outdated persona would require acknowledging that the identity built around it was conditional, performative, and incomplete. That recognition would not feel like growth to the narcissist. It would feel like annihilation. So instead of transitioning, they double down. They repeat old narratives. They cling to former titles, former victories, former hierarchies. They speak more about who they were than who they are. The persona becomes rigid because rigidity feels safer than exposure. At the same time, the persona can no longer evolve. It cannot be updated because its core premise, external validation as identity, no longer yields results. The narcissist is thus trapped in a role that no longer works but cannot be surrendered. This produces a distinctive psychological tension, chronic frustration without insight, anger without direction, control without leverage. The world feels ungrateful, disrespectful, and disordered, not because it has changed arbitrarily, but because it no longer mirrors the narcissist's internal script. Younger generations are perceived not as different, but as illegitimate. Authority is demanded rather than embodied. Respect is expected rather than earned. And beneath this posture is a silent panic. If the mask fails now, there is no time left to build a new face. The second half of life does not offer narcissists the chance to reinvent themselves through expansion. It demands contraction, humility, and interior development qualities the outdated persona was designed specifically to avoid. As a result, the narcissist becomes psychologically stranded, living inside a mask that once moved them forward but now only keeps them frozen in place. If the outdated persona creates the stall, it is the shadow that seals it. In the second half of life, narcissists are not overwhelmed because the shadow suddenly appears. They are overwhelmed because it appears at a moment when it can no longer be denied and still cannot be integrated. In Jungian psychology, the shadow contains everything the conscious personality refuses to recognize as part of itself. For the narcissist, this shadow is unusually dense. It holds dependency, shame, envy, fear of insignificance, emotional need, and the primitive terror of being exposed as ordinary. Throughout the first half of life, this material is managed aggressively. It is not processed inwardly, it is expelled outwardly. Weakness is projected onto others. Dependency is framed as superiority. Shame is converted into contempt. Control becomes the primary defense against inner collapse. As long as the narcissist has enough energy, status, and attention, this system functions. The shadow stays buried because the persona is constantly reinforced. But the second half of life changes the energetic equation. The body no longer provides endless drive. Social leverage weakens. Recovery from stress slows. The psychological cost of constant defense rises. And when repression becomes too expensive, the shadow does not gently knock, it presses inward. The narcissist begins to feel emotions they spent a lifetime disowning, but without the psychological tools to metabolize them. This is where the trap tightens. Integrating the shadow would require the narcissist to accept traits they defined themselves against for decades. It would mean admitting vulnerability without converting it into dominance. It would mean acknowledging dependency without turning it into entitlement. Most threatening of all, it would mean recognizing that the grand self-image was a compensation, not a truth. For a non-narcissistic personality, this confrontation, while painful, can lead to depth, humility, and wisdom. For the narcissist, it threatens ego disintegration. The shadow is therefore neither integrated nor expelled. It lingers in a suspended state, leaking into consciousness through distortion. Bitterness replaces sadness. Suspicion replaces curiosity. Moral rigidity replaces reflection. The narcissist does not say, "I am afraid." They say, "People are incompetent." They do not say, "I feel irrelevant." They say, "The world has lost its standards." The shadow speaks, but only in projection. This produces a distinctive psychological atmosphere, constant irritation without relief. Everything feels wrong, but nothing feels fixable. Relationships become sites of accusation rather than connection. Younger people are experienced as threats simply by existing. Change itself feels hostile. And because the narcissist cannot recognize these reactions as internal processes, the sense of persecution grows. The world appears increasingly disrespectful, chaotic, and unjust. What is actually happening is simpler and more devastating. The internal system that once kept unwanted material outside has weakened, but the capacity for self-reflection has not grown to replace it. The narcissist is now exposed to parts of themselves they were never meant by their own construction to encounter directly. This is why the second half of life does not lead to emotional softening in narcissists, but to hardening. Compassion would require contact with pain. Pain would require responsibility. Responsibility would require a self capable of holding contradiction. That self was never developed. The shadow therefore remains raw, unprocessed, and corrosive. It does not transform into insight. It calcifies into grievance. And because there is no forward psychological movement available, the narcissist becomes locked in a repetitive inner loop, defending against what they are becoming while becoming it more intensely each year. What ultimately locks the narcissist in place is not aging itself, but a distorted relationship with time. In the second half of life, time stops functioning as a runway and becomes a mirror. For most people, this shift invites reflection. What has been lived? What has been avoided? What now requires reconciliation? For the narcissist, this temporal shift is intolerable. Their identity was built on forward motion, next goal, next conquest, next validation. Time was something to outrun, not inhabit. But when expansion slows, time no longer carries them forward, it surrounds them. And without an inner life capable of holding the present, the narcissist becomes psychologically stranded between eras. The past turns into a refuge rather than a foundation. Memories are not integrated, they are rehearsed. Former achievements are not honored and released. They are repeated obsessively as proof of continued relevance. The narcissist does not remember who they were in order to understand themselves. They remember in order to defend against who they are becoming. The future, meanwhile, offers no usable image. A future built on growth would require adaptation. A future built on meaning would require surrender. Both demand an internal center that was never developed. As a result, the future feels either threatening or empty. Planning collapses into control fantasies. Hope degenerates into entitlement. The present becomes unbearable because it contains neither applause nor direction. This creates a unique psychological freeze. Time passes, but the personality does not. The narcissist lives chronologically forward while remaining structurally fixed. Emotionally, this manifests as chronic nostalgia paired with constant irritation. Everything new feels wrong, everything old feels stolen. The world is perceived as moving too fast, and yet not recognizing what truly matters, namely, the narcissist's former importance. This is why many aging narcissists become obsessed with decline narratives. Society has fallen, standards have collapsed, respect no longer exists. These narratives are not cultural critiques, they are defenses against temporal displacement. By framing the present as inferior, the narcissist protects the illusion that their stagnation is not personal, but moral. Yet beneath this posture lies a deeper terror, the realization that time has been moving all along, and they have not been developing alongside it. For a psychologically integrated person, the second half of life allows time to slow internally, even as the years accelerate externally. For the narcissist, the opposite occurs. Inner time freezes, while outer time advances relentlessly. This mismatch produces mounting anxiety that cannot be named, only displaced. Regret cannot be metabolized because regret would require accountability. Acceptance cannot occur because acceptance would require limits. So the narcissist remains suspended in a perpetual yesterday, replaying what once worked, demanding it still work, and growing increasingly hostile as reality refuses to comply. This is not simply living in the past, it is being imprisoned by it. The second half of life does not ask the narcissist to move forward, it asks them to be present. And presence is precisely what a personality built on avoidance of the inner world cannot sustain. By the time the narcissist reaches the second half of life, the relational world has already narrowed, but not in the way they believe. They often tell themselves that people became disloyal, weaker, more selfish, or less respectful. What is actually happening is more precise. Relationships that were built on persona can no longer function when persona loses leverage. In earlier years, narcissistic relationships were sustained by asymmetry. The narcissist provided direction, certainty, charisma, or status. Others provided admiration, tolerance, emotional labor, or silence. This imbalance was disguised as leadership, strength, or generosity. It worked as long as the narcissist occupied a position that others needed. But the second half of life erodes that necessity. Children grow independent. Partners grow exhausted. Colleagues no longer depend on authority rooted in image rather than substance. New relationships require reciprocity, presence, and emotional availability capacities the narcissist never developed. This is where the trap becomes relationally absolute. The narcissist cannot form genuinely new bonds because new bonds require vulnerability and mutual recognition. They also cannot maintain old bonds because those bonds were conditional on power that has faded. What remains is a shrinking circle populated either by people who tolerate them out of habit or by no one at all. Yet even in isolation, intimacy does not emerge. Loneliness is often misunderstood as the absence of people. For the narcissist, loneliness is the absence of relational depth. They may be surrounded by others and still feel profoundly alone because no one is relating to their true inner state, nor could they tolerate that exposure if it occurred. As the second half of life progresses, relationships become increasingly transactional or conflict-driven. Conversations turn into corrections. Differences become disrespect. Boundaries are interpreted as betrayal. Because the narcissist lacks the capacity for mutuality, every relationship becomes a power negotiation. And power, at this stage, is increasingly scarce. This scarcity intensifies resentment. Former partners are reinterpreted as ungrateful. Children are experienced as disobedient rather than autonomous. Friends are dismissed as disappointing rather than distant. The narcissist does not ask what changed in themselves. They ask who failed them. This relational deadlock has a final, cruel dimension. Even when someone remains out of duty, fear, or loyalty, the narcissist still cannot feel met. Emotional closeness would require dropping the mask, but dropping the mask would reveal dependency, regret, and fear. So intimacy is simultaneously demanded and resisted. The narcissist wants closeness without exposure, loyalty without equality, care without accountability. No human relationship can sustain this contradiction. Over time, others either withdraw or emotionally disengage. What the narcissist experiences is abandonment. What is actually occurring is relational exhaustion. The second half of life does not create this isolation. It exposes the fact that connection was never built on shared being, only on shared illusion. When illusion collapses, there is nothing to return to. This is why aging narcissists often appear surrounded yet unreachable, angry yet empty, demanding yet profoundly alone. They are not losing relationships. They are discovering that they never had relationships capable of surviving truth. At this point, the narcissist's struggle is no longer situational. It is structural. The second half of life does not merely confront them with loss, limitation, or disappointment. It demands a psychological task they are fundamentally unequipped to perform. This task is what Jung described as individuation, the movement toward an integrated self that can hold contradiction, accept limitation, and assume responsibility for its own inner life. Individuation is not self-improvement. It is not reinvention. It is a slow dismantling of the false center in favor of something more honest and more stable. And this is precisely where the narcissist becomes permanently stuck. Individuation requires humility, not as an attitude, but as a capacity. It requires the ability to say, without collapse, I was wrong. I depended on others. I harmed. I avoided. I am not what I pretended to be. For most people, these realizations are painful, but survivable, because the ego is flexible enough to reorganize around truth. For the narcissist, the ego is not flexible. It is brittle. It was constructed to defend against shame, not to metabolize it. Accepting responsibility would not feel corrective. It would feel annihilating. This is why the narcissist cannot move forward psychologically in the second half of life. Growth would require the very thing narcissism was designed to prevent: a collapse of grandiosity without the collapse of self. Because this distinction was never developed, collapse is experienced as total. As a result, the narcissist chooses stagnation over transformation. They do not consciously decide to remain stuck. Their structure leaves no other option. Every path forward demands an internal reckoning they cannot survive. Every attempt at self-examination triggers defensiveness, projection, or blame. Individuation also requires the capacity to tolerate ambivalence, to hold love and resentment, pride and regret, strength and vulnerability simultaneously. Narcissism cannot hold ambivalence. It splits. People are either admirable or contemptible. The self is either superior or threatened. This splitting becomes more rigid with age, not less. As life narrows, the narcissist's inner world simplifies rather than deepens. Nuance disappears. Moral certainty hardens. Blame crystallizes. What could have become wisdom turns into dogma. What could have become acceptance turns into grievance. This is the final trap of the second half of life for the narcissist. They are not blocked by circumstances. They are blocked by the impossibility of becoming real without losing the illusion that once kept them alive. Individuation asks for a self that can stand without applause. The narcissist has never practiced standing without it, so they remain where they are, psychologically unfinished, emotionally defended, and increasingly hostile to a world that now demands authenticity instead of performance. This is not a temporary delay. It is an endpoint. The second half of life offers transformation, but it does not negotiate. And for the narcissist, the price of entry is the one thing they cannot pay: the surrender of the false self without the destruction of the true one they never built. By now, the pattern should be clear, not as a theory, but as a lived psychological reality. The narcissist's suffering in the second half of life is not something you caused, delayed, or failed to prevent. It is not the result of insufficient love, patience, explanation, or sacrifice. And this is the most important implication of everything you have just heard. If you have ever felt responsible for keeping a narcissist stable, hopeful, motivated, or emotionally alive, that responsibility was never yours to begin with. Many people remain entangled far too long because they misread the narcissist's stagnation as vulnerability. They see the bitterness, the rigidity, the isolation, and assume it signals a need for more care. In reality, it signals a structural impasse. The second half of life confronts everyone with the same demand: develop an inner life capable of standing without external reinforcement. Some people rise to this demand. Narcissists do not. And no amount of relational effort from the outside can substitute for the internal work they refuse to do. This is why trying to save a narcissist in this stage quietly destroys the rescuer. You are pulled into maintaining a persona that no longer works, absorbing projections that no longer dissipate, and stabilizing emotions that have no internal container. The more you adapt, the more immobile they become. The more you explain, the more they harden. The more you stay, the less space exists for anything real to emerge. Understanding this is not an act of cruelty. It is an act of clarity. The second half of life reveals limits not just of energy and time, but of responsibility. You cannot carry someone across a psychological threshold they are structurally unable to cross. Detachment in this context is not abandonment, it is alignment with reality. When you stop orienting your life around their stagnation, something critical happens. The system loses its external support, not as punishment, but as truth. The narcissist experiences this as betrayal or indifference. What it actually is the removal of an illusion that someone else can compensate for the absence of an inner self. And for you, this recognition restores something essential. It returns agency. It dissolves false guilt. It allows grief to be directed toward what was never possible rather than what you failed to achieve. The second half of life is not only where narcissists become stuck, it is also where others finally see that staying stuck with them was never an act of loyalty, it was an act of self-erasure. And once that clarity settles, the question is no longer why they cannot move forward. The question becomes whether you will. The second half of life does not dramatize endings. It does something far more exacting. It removes the noise, and when the noise is gone, only structure remains. This is why narcissists do not collapse in any cinematic sense. They endure, they persist, they continue. But they do so inside a psychological architecture that no longer moves. What looks like survival from the outside is, internally, a slow petrification. The defenses harden, the narratives repeat, the emotional range narrows. Nothing truly new enters because nothing inside can receive it. This is the final condition of narcissism in the second half of life. Not destruction, but stasis. Not punishment, but exposure. Life stops demanding performance and starts requiring presence. And presence reveals what performance once concealed: an undeveloped inner world unable to metabolize time, loss, or truth. For those who have lived in proximity to this dynamic, the most dangerous mistake is to confuse endurance with health. The narcissist may still speak confidently, assert authority, or claim insight, but insight that does not transform behavior is not insight. It is repetition with better language. Wisdom that does not soften the psyche is not wisdom, it is ideology. The second half of life draws this distinction mercilessly. It does not ask who someone once was. It observes who they are becoming when there is nothing left to prove. And in that observation, the narcissist is revealed as unfinished, not because they lacked opportunity, but because they avoided the one task that could not be delegated, outsourced, or performed. The construction of an inner self capable of standing without mirrors. This is not a tragedy that unfolds suddenly. It is one that settles quietly and stays. And once it settles, nothing external can reverse it. The work that was postponed can no longer be rushed. The self that was avoided can no longer be improvised. The second half of life closes not with drama, but with a verdict rendered through stillness. Those who build inward are given depth. Those who build outward alone are left with echoes. And the difference between the two is not age, fate, or cruelty. It is the willingness or refusal to become real before reality made pretending impossible. At its deepest level, this is not a story about narcissists. It is a story about what happens when a human life avoids inward development for too long. Narcissism simply makes the pattern visible because it exaggerates it. The second half of life does not punish personalities. It clarifies them. It strips away compensation and asks a single question. Is there anything inside that can hold reality without distortion? For some, the answer is yes, and the result is depth, humility, and a quieter strength. For narcissists, the answer is no, and the result is fixation on the past, on grievance, on control, on being right instead of being real. This is why their suffering feels circular rather than transformative. Nothing is learned. Nothing is integrated. Pain accumulates without meaning. And this is the final insight the second half of life delivers. External success can delay inner reckoning, but it cannot cancel it. What is avoided early becomes unavoidable later, not because life is cruel, but because reality eventually demands coherence. If there is one lesson to take from this, it is not fear of becoming like the narcissist. It is respect for the quiet, unglamorous work of building an inner life before time removes your distractions. Presence is not something you develop when everything slows down. It is something you practice long before it is required. The second half of life does not create wisdom. It reveals whether wisdom was ever being cultivated at all. The second half of life does not arrive to negotiate. It arrives to tell the truth, not loudly, not cruelly, but unmistakably. It removes distractions, thins the crowd, slows the body, and asks a question that cannot be answered with charm, control, or intelligence. Who are you when nothing is feeding your image anymore? For the narcissist, this question exposes a structure built entirely to avoid being asked. And that is why they do not transform. They remain suspended, functional but hollow, enduring but unmoved, mistaking survival for wholeness. Yet this ending is not meant to frighten you. It is meant to orient you. Because the real warning in this story is not about narcissism. It is about postponement, about trading inner work for outward success, about assuming there will always be time later to become real. There is not. Life eventually closes the stage and turns the lights inward. When it does, those who built a self beyond performance discover a quieter strength. Those who did not are left arguing with time itself. Let this video not be a diagnosis of others, but a mirror for your own direction. The second half of life is not a punishment for what you were. It is a reckoning with what you chose not to become. And the most meaningful response to that truth is not judgment, resentment, or fear, but commitment. Commitment to build inward while you still can. To cultivate presence before it is demanded. To choose depth over display, coherence over applause, and reality over illusion long before reality removes your ability to choose.